here today is Dr. Julie Godefroy, sustainability consultant, and I think recently head of a net zero policy at CIBSE. Over to you, Julie.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Yeah, great, thank you. Hi, so I'm going to talk about the net zero carbon building standard, which I know has been mentioned a few times already. Apologies if some of you have recently heard about it, because we had a big round of initial presentations. Just as a show of hand, actually, who in the room could you raise your hand if you've already heard about it, just so I get a sense? Okay, so a good mix. So apologies for those who already know all of this. So this is an initiative which was launched last year. And as you can see, it's not a single organization. I'm not speaking here as CIBSE, but it was launched collaboratively by a really big range of organizations: the BBP, BRE, Carbon Trust, CIBSE, ISFACTI, LETI, RBA, RICS, and Green Building Council. I cannot remember another initiative where all of these organizations agreed to work together and still agreed a year later. So that's the positive. The downside is obviously it means things are sometimes a bit slow. So, but this was very, very clear feedback from the industry, the fact that people wanted organizations to work together. They wanted a net zero standard. The industry wants a single definition and clear requirements, but they do not want it to come from one organization only, because they're worried there will be many more doing slightly different things. So as an overview of what it is and what it isn't, before I tell you a bit more detail about how we are developing it, what we are creating is essentially the rule book. So the definition of net zero, the requirements, what you would have to achieve. We are not creating the certification alone. So we're just creating the rules, and any organization, for example, the BRE, but there could be many more, any organization could then develop their certification scheme around it. We collectively, as a net zero standard, do not intend to provide these certification services. And as I've said, it's being developed collaboratively, and it will not be owned or developed by a single organization. It is addressing whole life carbon, so operational and embodied, and not only upfront carbon, in construction, but also throughout the life of the building. What it is not doing is addressing other things. So we have enough work on our hands with carbon. It may be that in the future it evolves. It may be that in its form it's integrated into other things. For example, BREEAM in the future may decide to update their approach to energy and carbon using this. I have no view on this, we don't know. But we are not looking at air quality, at health and well-being, resource scarcity, biodiversity, ecology, or flood risk. It's a standard about carbon. It's looking at buildings, and most, but not all typologies, but most. So we are not doing heavy industry, but we at the moment have dedicated sector groups on homes, offices, schools, logistics and warehouses, sports and leisure, retail, higher education, healthcare, science and technology, hotels, commercial resi, culture and entertainment, and data centers, and then a heritage specialist group. We are not looking at civil infrastructure projects, or essentially it's just about buildings. And everything will be transparent, openly available when we publish the draft, when we publish the standards. Not only the requirements will be available, but how we developed it. And you'll see in my presentation that we are gathering quite a large evidence base, including data on the existing stock, additional modeling, that will all be available. So in addition to the standard itself, you will have a good view of how we got there and what information that tells you about industry and the current building stock. This is partially why at the moment we do not have plans for it to be a British standard or an ISO standard, because we want the standard to remain completely accessible. It's not that we are philosophically against it becoming a BSI or an ISO, but at the moment they are expensive publications typically, and we do not want to restrict access to the standard. It will be science-based, which means, and I'll come to that in more detail, but what we want is create a standard, which means that buildings contribute their fair share to a UK net zero, well, a net zero UK in 2050. And that in itself is informed by the 1.5 degree pathway. We are not at the moment, we do not have particular links to government policy. Obviously, once it's available, we would love it to be adopted by local or national government. We want a broad impact as deep as possible, but at the moment, it's an industry-based standard, and we do not want to be restricted in case it was adopted by government policy. Now, that's what it is and what it isn't. We are not operating on our own. Where there will be, for example, rules for carbon accounting, calculation methodologies, etc. As much as possible, we intend to follow the RICS professional statement. And by that, we mean the latest version. If you are not aware of it already, the consultation on the revision of the professional statement is out at the moment. It's still open for a few weeks. So if you are interested in whole life carbon assessments, do have a look and comment. That's on the, say, assessment methodology. What we're also doing is collaborating with the BECD, the Built Environment Carbon Database. Again, the BECD is a collaborative exercise with a lot of the institutions, IBA, ISRT, CIBSE, collaborating so that you would have industry would have a single place where if you want to report energy and carbon performance on buildings, operational and embodied, gradually that would become the main database. It doesn't mean that the others that exist, which provide a bit more information on certain things, would disappear. For example, CIBSE or the Low Energy Carbon Database, but this would become the main one on a project basis to get whole life carbon information. How we are developing it, how we are organized. I can't see if I have a pointer, so I'll move. Essentially, we have a governance board, and they are looking at things like the long-term strategy, how the standard will be maintained, for example. And they're also in charge of stakeholder engagement, including upstream engagement, investors, developers, etc. There is a technical steering group with representatives from all the organizations that I mentioned. So there is an RBA representative, I am CIBSE representative, etc. And it's chaired by Clara Bagnall-George from LETI. Once the standard is out in draft, it means that there will be also hopefully as many people as possible doing technical testing. You will all be invited to be technical testers. And then under the technical steering group, there are a few task groups. So there's one on operational energy, one on embodied carbon, one on top-down modeling. I'll say a bit more about what that means. One on carbon accounting, and one on reporting, disclosure, and verification. All of these groups are led by someone from the technical steering group, and they have about 20 volunteers from industry. And then we have sector-specific groups, so hotels, homes, science and tech, etc., between 10 and 30 people in each sector who bring dedicated sector expertise, modeling, advice on considerations that would apply particularly in their sector. So as you can imagine, healthcare needs people who only work on healthcare. You can't develop a standard with generalists. And we also engage more broadly industry in the call for evidence, etc. So it's really a massive exercise. there must be, possibly above 1,000 now people who have been involved. If any of you have been, thank you very much. Please bear with us and continue to engage. Thank you. So where we are at the moment, we intend to have the first revision by the end of the year. And that would mean at the moment we're developing the limits and targets such that we intend to have a technical test, a draft for technical testing out in May. Look out for that. And then that would be out in the summer until August. So it would be for anyone wanting to comment on the limits we are proposing for energy use and embodied carbon. And after that, we will take comments on board. By then, we should also have the result on the top-down modeling, and that will lead us to the first version by the end of the year. This is taking a while because we are obviously not starting from scratch. Wherever we can, we are aligning with existing guidance. For example, from LETI, initiatives like Neighbors, the CIBSE LETI FAQs which were published last year, and then top-down approaches like CREN, etc. There are places where we will differ, but we are not starting from scratch, be reassured with that. However, it's taking a while because at the moment, a lot of these existing guidance and targets, they applied in 3 sectors: offices, schools, and homes. They didn't really apply to other sectors. And also because very often they looked at new build only, and they were not necessarily compatible with the Net Zero Carbon UK, etc. What we are trying to do essentially is to combine a top-down approach, so making sure that buildings contribute to a Net Zero UK, that they do not use more net zero energy or more carbon, emit more carbon than will be available for the built environment. So what is required? And also informed by the bottom-up analysis, i.e. what is possible. So, and for that, we're obviously looking at what is possible, both in terms of operational energy and embodied carbon. These 2 exercises will then be combined. There will be an analysis across all the sectors, an analysis across new build and existing buildings to see how we can share the efforts across the stock, what sort of buffer we have, because obviously we're speculating quite a bit about what may happen in 5 years, in 10 years, etc. But we will do scenario testing. And out of this, we will come up with the targets and limits. So hopefully, in a good world, what is required is already achievable. If not, well, we have some backup ideas. A little bit in more detail, how the bottom-up analysis is going on. Essentially, we have our sector experts, as I said, who some of them are very involved in net zero carbon projects already. So they are able to say, well, this is the sort of performance that you might be able to achieve, or this is the sort of assumption in your model. These are my best projects, etc. We are doing some modeling, energy performance modeling for operational data, not parcel, just state the obvious, and embodied carbon assessments. We also had a large call for evidence. So we received best practice projects. Some of you may have submitted it. So best practice projects in energy terms, embodied carbon assessments for individual projects. We also received large data sets, which was very exciting coming from CIBSE and working with UCL. So you probably know that in some sectors, we have reasonable benchmarks from CIBSE and other sources. But from sectors, we hardly know anything. Or we know that the benchmarks are completely out of date. And in our call for evidence earlier in the year, we asked for people whether they had additional sources of benchmarks or large data sets. And we really didn't know what we would get. Some of us were very cynical, but in some sectors, we've received a lot of information. So this is, I think, almost as exciting, if not more than the standard itself. It's all the knowledge we are gathering and all the energy from all the volunteers to update some of this information. So when we publish the standard in the evidence base, there will not only be what we think the targets and limits should be, but also updated profiles of some of these sectors and energy use across some of these sectors. Some of them, like data centers or hotel, traditionally, we don't really know much about publicly. So this is very exciting. That picture of the existing stock as well as best practice. Thank you if you contributed to the call for evidence. Just a little more on how we're doing the operational energy side, and I know only have a minute left. So each sector specific is working to the same guidelines, but they are adding their sector specific outlook. So each sector, for example, hotels, has defined what their subsectors should be, which subsector should be given different limits. For example, in schools, you might say primary and secondary schools will have different energy use and embodied carbon limits. They're also defining their core uses and special end uses. Again, in the example of schools, all of them have teaching space, that's a core use. Some have a pool, some don't. That's a special end use and you give it an additional allocation. They're defining their metrics. For example, I'm not saying this will be the case, but for example, in addition to kilowatt hours per square meter GIA, some sectors may use in schools kilowatt hour per pupil per year, or hotels may use per bedroom, or retail may use per square meter NLA, etc. You understand why we need sector groups who are experts in understanding their sector. They're defining their profile, so that analysis of the existing stock, what is median practice and best practice, analyzing the best projects that were submitted to us, carrying out their modeling, and then basically doing modeling on two scenarios, which we call current best practice. So that's if you were to design a project now, what would be best practice? And then in case these levels come up and they are not ambitious enough at all, and we won't meet our energy and carbon budgets, we're also asking them to model future exemplar. So that's really stretching everything. And we're asking them to imagine if you were on a design phase in 10 years, where do you think there may be technological improvements? Where might you relax some criteria, for example, accept slightly higher summer temperatures if really we had to, because of the climate emergency and meeting our budget? How might we improve, not necessarily in technical ways, but for example, they could assume a smaller performance gap in their model, etc. So it's a much higher, much more stretched level of ambition. And basically it means that in a good world, when we have the top-down model, we know that we can achieve it with current best practice, but potentially we need to stretch a little bit more. The ones that we are working on at the moment are new buildings, and once that's done, we'll work on constrained buildings, so retrofit, landlord-tenant situations, etc. And that's it. So thank you very much. Please, if you've been involved, please stay in touch and have a look out for our draft standard. You can still feed into it, especially if you are expert in one of these sectors or an energy modeler and would like to contribute. We are always looking for volunteers, and look out for our test in May. Thank you.